What takes place when one of Hollywood's most cherished comedic stars appears for what is expected to be a cheerful and entertaining interview, but instead faces sharp criticism from a host who seems intent on challenging him at every turn? The situation centers around a tense moment that reportedly led to Jim Carrey leaving the stage during a televised discussion. The events unfolded in a way that surprised viewers and those present in the studio. The studio lighting shone brightly that morning as Jim Carrey took his seat on the set, wearing his well-known cheerful expression. He had arrived to discuss his newest project and likely anticipated a friendly conversation filled with humor and reflections on his memorable performances. Instead, the conversation quickly shifted into unfamiliar and uncomfortable territory. Joy Behar leaned forward, her body language suggesting that she intended to steer the conversation toward a more confrontational direction. She began by bringing up Jim's recent public remarks about the entertainment world, noting that some critics had described his opinions as unstable or unusual. Jim's smile weakened slightly, though he remained calm and composed. He responded by explaining that spending many years working in the industry had changed his outlook. Over time, he had gained insight into the inner workings behind the glamorous surface, which he described as eye-opening and transformative. Joy quickly challenged his explanation, suggesting that many people believed his viewpoints indicated he had lost touch with reality. The tension in the studio became noticeable as the other hosts reacted with visible discomfort. Whoopi Goldberg shifted slightly in her chair, appearing aware of the growing strain in the conversation. Sarah Haynes glanced down at her notes, while Sonny Hostin raised her eyebrow, seemingly surprised by the intensity of Joy's remarks. Jim's expression became more serious as he questioned whether the discussion was meant to be an interview or an interrogation. He clarified that he had come to talk about his professional work, not to have his mental state examined by someone who had not experienced his personal or professional journey. Joy dismissed his comment, accusing him of portraying himself as a victim. She argued that he frequently made strange remarks regarding hidden forces within Hollywood and spiritual transformations, only to become upset when confronted about them. Jim repeated her description of his statements, clearly irritated by the characterization, "Beoui ba." He insisted that he had always spoken honestly about his experiences and beliefs. He suggested that discomfort with his views might reflect broader resistance to unconventional perspectives rather than any fault in his honesty. Joy leaned back with a confident expression and continued pressing him, pointing out his discussions about celebrities acting as participants in larger systems and his philosophical comments about ego and cosmic awareness. She questioned whether he understood how such ideas might sound to ordinary audiences. Jim responded emotionally, emphasizing that no individual has the authority to determine what is considered normal for others. He explained that certain life experiences had reshaped his understanding of success, fame, and personal fulfillment. He acknowledged that sharing these realizations might sound unusual to some listeners, but he expressed no regret about being truthful about his personal growth. The audience sat quietly, sensing the seriousness of the exchange, which had grown far more intense than the show's typical discussions. Camera operators adjusted their angles, capturing the escalating moment. Joy continued her criticism, reminding Jim that he had earned enormous wealth by entertaining audiences and suggesting that he now appeared ungrateful toward the same industry that helped him achieve global fame. She accused him of portraying the entertainment world as harmful or morally questionable. Jim firmly responded that he had never labeled the industry as evil. However, he maintained that certain elements within it could be damaging. The poor wealthy actor struggling with an existential dilemma. "Jim, you chose this path. No one forced you to become a star." The remark clearly struck a nerve. Everyone in the studio could see the shift in his expression. His face flushed, and for a brief second, the composure he had maintained seemed to slip. He held Joy's gaze for several long moments, his breathing slightly heavier. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. It was steadier, colder, and more controlled than before. "You're right," he said slowly. "No one forced me into fame. But no one warned me I'd be sitting across from people who seemed to take satisfaction in cutting others down for daring to evolve. Joy's eyes narrowed. I'm not attacking you. I'm asking you to be accountable for your statements. That's not the same thing. Accountable! Jim let out a short, humorless laugh. Joy, in the last few years, I've taken more responsibility for my life than I did in decades before. I've examined my mistakes, my patterns, the choices that shaped me. I've done the inner work to understand myself. What I refuse to do is apologize for speaking honestly about what I've discovered. Whoopi finally stepped in. Jim, I think what Joy is trying to express is that when you have a platform as large as yours, your words carry influence. People pay attention. And that's exactly why I feel obligated to speak truthfully, Jim responded, turning toward Whoopi with a calmer tone. You understand what it means to use your voice authentically. I'm not instructing anyone how to live. I'm simply sharing my own experiences. Joy quickly interjected again. Your experiences include comments that could harm other people's livelihoods. When you describe the industry as fake or manipulative, you're not just speaking about yourself. You're making sweeping claims that impact real individuals. Which individuals? Jim asked, frustration creeping back into his voice. The executives you accuse of treating actors like products. The agents you imply care only about commissions. The publicists you suggest fabricate false identities. And beyond them, there are thousands of crew members, writers, directors, producers, and support staff who depend on this business to provide for their families, Joy replied firmly. When you characterize Hollywood in such a negative light, you're diminishing their hard work too. Jim shook his head slowly. You're deliberately twisting my words. I've never criticized the dedicated people who bring films and television to life. I have immense respect for the crews, the artists, the technicians who pour their energy into their craft. My comments were never about them. He leaned forward slightly, trying to clarify. What I've spoken about are systemic pressures, the culture that prioritizes image over authenticity, the constant chase for approval and validation, the expectation that success is measured solely in dollars or awards. Those are the things I questioned. Joy remained unconvinced. But when you frame it that way, it sounds like you're condemning the entire system. I'm not condemning anything, Jim replied firmly. I'm reflecting. There's a difference. A difference. I spent years chasing accolades and financial milestones because I thought they would complete me. When I realized they didn't, I had to confront that truth. Sharing that realization isn't an attack. It's honesty. The studio remained silent, the audience sensing the gravity of the exchange. The light-hearted tone typically associated with the show had completely vanished. The conversation had transformed into something raw and deeply personal. Jim continued, his voice steady. If someone hears my story and decides to examine their own priorities, that's their choice. I'm not telling anyone to abandon their careers or distrust their colleagues. I'm speaking about my internal journey, about recognizing that fulfillment doesn't come from applause or box office numbers. Joy crossed her arms slightly. But the way you phrase it can be interpreted as suggesting the industry itself is corrupt. Any large institution has flaws, Jim answered. That doesn't mean every person within it is flawed. Acknowledging imperfections doesn't equal betrayal. It's possible to appreciate the opportunities I've had while still critiquing aspects that felt unhealthy to me. The tension lingered as both held their positions. Jim's frustration was evident, but so was his resolve. He seemed determined to defend his perspective without backing down, while Joy remained equally steadfast in challenging him. The discussion had shifted far beyond promoting a new project and into a broader debate about fame, responsibility, and the price of success. I'm referring to a structure that puts revenue ahead of human beings, that elevates image above sincerity, Jim said firmly. Joy leaned in again, her tone sharp and deliberate. Are they really so different? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're perfectly willing to accept the paycheck that system provides while criticizing it at the same time. Doesn't that strike you as contradictory? The studio grew quiet, except for the faint mechanical buzz of cameras recording every second. Jim studied her carefully, as if weighing whether responding would even be worthwhile. Phew! After a brief pause, he spoke. You know what I consider contradictory, Joy? Acting as though encouraging someone to live truthfully is a personal attack. You've spent decades in this field. You've witnessed what it can do to people. You've seen gifted performers lose their identity chasing recognition and wealth. Yet you're defending a framework you know can be damaging simply because it's worked out well for you. Joy's expression hardened. I'm standing up for an industry that has created art, employment, and economic opportunity. I'm standing up for the idea that people who've benefited enormously from it might show a little appreciation instead of constantly highlighting the negatives of their privileged existence. There it is, Jim replied, a faint, almost sorrowful smile crossing his face. Appreciation. That's what this really comes down to, isn't it? You believe that because I've achieved success, I should stay quiet and just be grateful. As if achievement without inner peace isn't simply a more polished version of suffering. Joy rolled her eyes dismissively. You sound like a motivational speaker who's never encountered genuine hardship. The remark hit with visible force. Jim's posture stiffened, and the mood in the room shifted instantly. I never encountered genuine hardship, he repeated softly. Do you know anything about my early life? Do you understand what it meant to grow up without financial stability? Watching my father move from one job to another just to keep us afloat? Do you know what it felt like to believe my humor was the only way to shield my family from despair? Joy seemed momentarily caught off guard, as she quickly regained composure. I'm not dismissing your past, but let's be realistic. You've been affluent and well-known for most of your adult years. Whatever difficulties you faced growing up, you've had the means to address them for a long time. Are the means to address them? Jim's voice rose again. You can't purchase healing. You can't buy confidence or self-worth. You can't write a check that fills an emptiness created by years of pretending to be someone else. Wealth doesn't magically erase wounds, no matter how convenient that belief might be. Sarah attempted once more to shift the tone. And maybe we could discuss how your personal reflections have influenced your artistry. Imagine that kind of introspection changes the way you approach roles. But Jim's focus remained locked on Joy. His gaze was steady, intense. You want to know what I've discovered? The people who react most strongly against authenticity are often the ones most invested in maintaining their own facades. When someone attacks you for speaking openly about your struggles, it usually says more about their discomfort than about your honesty. Joy's jaw tightened. Are you analyzing me now? Because unless I'm mistaken, you're not a licensed therapist. And you're not certified to evaluate someone else's personal evolution, Jim shot back. Yet that hasn't stopped you from spending this entire segment dissecting everything I've shared. The atmosphere felt as if it might snap at any second. At any second. Sonny looked visibly uneasy, while Whoopi gently shook her head, clearly wishing the exchange had unfolded differently. You know what I think, Joy said, her voice layered with condescension. I think this is just a stage you're going through. I think eventually you'll return to reality and realize this spiritual awakening persona is just another role. Another character you created because maybe the real Jim Carrey didn't feel compelling enough anymore. Her words lingered heavily in the air. Jim stared at her for several long seconds. His face shifted through a range of emotions, wounded disbelief, frustration, sadness, and finally, something that resembled pity. Another role, he repeated quietly. He exhaled slowly before continuing. Inay. You see, that's exactly the problem. When someone who has spent decades performing begins speaking sincerely, people assume it must be an act. That vulnerability has to be another performance. It can't possibly be real. He paused, his voice steady but subdued. For most of my life, I was rewarded for exaggeration, for elastic expressions, for becoming whoever the script required. That was my profession. But somewhere along the way, I realized I had no script for myself. I had characters, accolades, applause, but not clarity. The audience remained silent, sensing the weight behind his words. I'm not claiming enlightenment, Jim continued. I'm not positioning myself as some guru. I'm describing the process of shedding illusions. About fame, about identity, about what success is supposed to mean. If that makes people uncomfortable, maybe it's because we're conditioned to equate prosperity with happiness. Joy crossed her arms, but did not interrupt this time. I've played enough parts to recognize when I'm wearing a mask, he said. The irony is that the moment I try to take it off, I'm accused of putting on a new one. Growth gets mistaken for instability. Reflection gets labeled as delusion. He leaned back slightly, the earlier intensity giving way to a calmer resolve. If choosing honesty over image looks strange to some viewers, I can live with that. What I can't do is pretend that external achievements solved internal questions they never addressed. The room felt suspended in a fragile stillness, the earlier sharpness replaced by something heavier and more contemplative. Jim's final words hung quietly in the space between them, no longer fueled by anger, but by conviction. Joy, what if I told you that every exaggerated face, every over-the-top character that made audiences laugh, those were the real performances? What if the man sitting here now, trying to speak honestly about what it means to exist and struggle and grow, is actually the most genuine version of me you've ever seen? Joy gave a casual shrug. Then I'd say that the genuine version of you is far less entertaining than the one people paid to watch. The quiet that followed felt suffocating. Jim remained still, absorbing her words. When he finally lifted his head, there was a new steadiness in his eyes, a sharp clarity that hadn't been visible before. You just confirmed everything I've been saying, he replied, his voice even but resolute. You just demonstrated why so many people in this business are unhappy. Why some turn to addictions, why others break down under pressure, why some don't survive it. Joy attempted to interject, but Jim raised his hand gently. Please, let me finish. What you just said is that my authentic self has less value than a crafted performance. Do you understand that? You told a human being that who they truly are matters less than how well they entertain you. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably. Whoopi shook her head, clearly troubled. Sarah looked genuinely distressed by how far things had gone. Yeah, I didn't mean it that way, Joy began, though her tone lacked conviction. You meant it exactly that way, Jim answered firmly. And that mindset, the belief that a person's worth is measured by how amusing they are, is the very toxicity I've been describing. That's why I had to step back and figure out who I was beneath the spotlight. Joy's face flushed. You're overreacting. I'm just pointing out that your audience connected with your comedy, not with lectures about self-discovery. In my reflections are lectures now? Jim repeated. For the first time since the exchange began, he smiled, though there was no warmth in it. He spoke about growing up with very little. I spoke about trauma. I spoke about losing myself in fame and doing the hard work to reclaim my identity. And you reduced that to rambling. He rose slowly from his chair, reaching for the microphone attached to his jacket. The movement alone sent a ripple through the studio. This is exactly why I rarely agree to interviews anymore, he said, as he carefully unclipped the mic. This is why I choose platforms carefully, because too often, vulnerability is mistaken for weakness. Growth is treated like nonsense. Authenticity is dismissed as less valuable than entertainment. Joy stood as well, her composure beginning to slip. We could have had a rational conversation. We could have, Jim agreed calmly. But you decided to turn it into a personal attack. You mocked my experiences and told me the real version of me wasn't good enough. Whoopi stepped in, her voice measured. Let's pause. We can reset this. Jim turned to her respectfully. I admire you deeply, but I won't sit here and allow my character to be dismantled under the banner of journalism. This isn't journalism. It's hostility. 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 Joy shot back. You came here to promote your work. That means answering tough questions. If that's too difficult, maybe interviews aren't for you. Tough questions? Jim let out a short, humorless laugh. Questioning my sanity, belittling my past, trivializing my growth, and suggesting I'm only valuable as a performer? That's not tough questioning. That's insult disguised as inquiry. The audience remained frozen and silent. Several people had their phones raised, aware they were witnessing something extraordinary. Or behaving unprofessionally, Joy said sharply. This is live television. You can't just walk off because you dislike the direction. Jim paused and looked at her with unmistakable sadness. What's truly unprofessional is inviting someone to discuss their work and then spending the entire segment attacking them personally. What's unprofessional is using a platform to undermine someone's character instead of engaging with their perspective. He turned toward the cameras. This is what I've been talking about. This culture where people are valued only for how well they entertain, where being genuine is treated as a flaw, where personal transformation becomes a punchline. And now you're making a spectacle. Joy snapped. No, Jim replied. raising his eyebrows slightly. The spectacle started when you decided to frame this as a takedown. I'm simply declining to participate in it any longer. Sarah made one final effort. Maybe we could focus on your upcoming projects. You have exciting things ahead. Jim offered her a softer expression. I appreciate you trying to redirect this, but it's clear this isn't the space for a meaningful discussion. He scanned the studio, taking in the stunned crew members, the uneasy co-hosts, and Joy's visibly angry expression. You can't force someone to understand your path, he said clearly. You can't compel respect from someone determined to keep you in the box they've assigned you. And you can't have a sincere conversation with someone who sees sincerity as a defect. So you're just leaving? Joy demanded. That's your solution? Jim stopped briefly and turned back. The walking away from something toxic isn't avoidance. It's self-respect. It's recognizing when a conversation has no intention of being productive. He faced the cameras one last time. To anyone trying to figure out who they are beneath expectations, don't let anyone convince you your authentic self isn't enough. Don't let people tell you that evolving makes you unstable. Growth isn't weakness. Joy's voice rose again, nearly shouting that he couldn't simply leave mid-interview. What's inappropriate, Jim called back calmly, as he headed toward the exit, is inviting someone here only to dismantle them. Moments later, he walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned audience and a shaken panel. The cameras continued recording as the remaining host attempted to regain control, but the atmosphere had permanently shifted. Something raw had unfolded, an unmistakable clash between vulnerability and confrontation, and everyone present understood they had just witnessed a moment that would not be easily forgotten.